Hi, everybody. Derek Sloan here. Today, I have a very special guest with me, Professor David Haskell. David is a sociologist of religion at Wilfrid Laurier University. He has done many things before I've seen him testify in front of parliamentary committees. He has recently written a book called Christ or Collapse, and David kindly gave me a copy of his book prior to release, as he was looking for various people to review it. And as I told David, I'm given a lot of books, and I have literally in my I have the books behind me, as you can see, but up in my closet in my room, I have probably 20 to 30 books that are partially read, all of which deserve to be read, and I sort of chip away at them. This book here, I read, even though it was only released a month ago, and you probably gave this to me maybe 2 months ago. I forget the exact time frame. Um, I read the entire book without reading any other book in between. And your book, David, is not a it's not a short form manifesto. It's
No, no, it's not.
well over 500 pages. I forget the exact count. Very duly annotated and noted. There's lots of uh, research backing up your book. But we're here today to talk about your book. And the premise of your book is, as far as I can understand, and of course you're going to have the whole show to talk about it. But the subtitle of your book is "The Case Against Godless Government," and effectively what you are prescribing here, and you're using Canada and the United States as your examples, but I believe that you would believe that your work would be applicable broadly across the West and potentially
Sure.
elsewhere. But
Yeah.
the essentially what you're saying is as a Canadian, as an American society, we need to go back to Christian principles, and we need to have a country that is both friendly to and promoting Christian principles, much like it has for the totality of our existence. So the West has been um, outside of maybe the past 20 or 30 years, it was entirely uncontroversial to call the West a Christian society. It was called that by outsiders. It was called that by insiders. It's self-referred to itself that way. But we are now living in a time frame where some people, certainly many of our leaders, are actively hostile to Christian values and are trying to create a new sort of state and philosophy ex nihilo, sort of out of thin air, on conflicting values that change. And you make a case for returning to Christian values in your book. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, and you get into a lot of research. But we're here to talk about that today. And for anybody who doesn't know who I am, my name is Derek Sloan. I'm a former member of Parliament federally. I currently lead the provincial party, the Ontario Party. We've ran in the last two provincial elections, and our tagline is faith, family, and freedom. We are not um, explicitly a Christian party in the sense that you have to sign off on specific theological beliefs to run for us, but many of our candidates are Christians. Of course, I am a serious and committed Christian, and the ones that are not explicitly Christians are certainly Christian friendly. Again, it is not a specific requirement that we have, but again, when you're promoting faith, family, and freedom values, obviously that corresponds very closely with what a lot of Christians hold dear. So it is a natural sort of it fits well together. And personally, as somebody who has dedicated their life to thinking about the best way to run a country and a province, I have thought, how do we run Canada better? How do we run a province better? And we can, you can get into a policy discussion, but I have come to believe it's ultimately a values discussion. Obviously, there are policies that are better than others, but it's ultimately a values discussion. And I believe that if we don't have the values that have led our Western societies for 2,000 years, let's say, give or take a few hundred years, depending on which country we're talking about. But for as long as the West has been called the West, it is you know, its identity is interwoven with Christian history. I mean, they're inseparable. And so I do not believe that we can have a renaissance in our country without a renaissance in Christian faith writ large. And of course, there's a lot of aspects to that that we can get into. But I think it's exactly the conversation that we need to be having. And you know, in our politics right now, the conversation is largely, oh, you know, what about this tax rate or this policy or this pipeline? And it's not that those things are not important, but if we don't get down to brass tacks about underlying values, we will never recover the promise of Canada, the promise of the United States. And you know, some people like to talk about the standard of living that we used to have in this country 40, 50, 60 years ago, you know, where the average price of a house was less than the average annual income, right? You know, the average annual income at certain eras was $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a year. And at the same time, the average house was $6,000. The average take home pay out of a 10,000 paycheck was well over $9,000. And so we can talk about the economics of that, but without the values that drove the people that lived in that era, I don't think we'll ever get back to that kind of a lifestyle again. So with that with that little monologue there, David, I'd like you to just go ahead, introduce yourself, and let's talk about your book. Thank you so much for being here.
You know, there are so many points to pick up on that you've just put down, Derek. One thing, I'll let your audience know that I'm a professor, sociologist of religion, as you say, and I've spent the last 20 years looking at Christianity and culture. And I like to do it quantitatively. I like to see what the big numbers are saying, because the big numbers allow us to predict and to generalize. And in some ways, you've really nailed it. You were talking about your own party, the Ontario Party, and you were saying that it thrives on Christian values, but you don't have to be faith aligned. You do have to be politically aligned. And I take that similar stand in my own book. In the book, I'm arguing for a political project called traditional conservatism. And traditional conservatism, as I define it, and as it's been defined really through history, is the norms and values of Christianity applied to governance. So you don't have to accept the metaphysical ideas of Christianity, but you do have to accept the evidence. And by that, this is where my book comes in. I set out over 1,000 scholarly references showing that Christian norms and values are unmatched in leading to individual and societal flourishing. And it's on the preponderance of that evidence that I say to people, this is why we should choose to have them influence our laws. And you also mentioned, Derek, that the fact that they don't anymore, as of about 1960, that's an aberration. Prior to 1960, it was completely uncontroversial that we would just assume that Christian norms and values would influence our laws. And anything that I'm mentioning is going to be referenced in my book, and it'll have citations attached to it. So for example, in chapter 2, I go through the laws, the policies, the speeches of politicians, where I specifically show they intended for Christian norms and values to guide our land, whether it was the United States or Canada. In chapter 3, I go through and I say, I'm going to show you study after study after study that shows Christian norms and values are unmatched in providing flourishing. And I compare them to other secular worldviews, whether it's progressivism or libertarianism, but I also compare it to other religions too. And I show that no matter what the comparison is, Christianity comes out on top. That's not me trying to be conceited. That's me appealing to the evidence. So there were a number of things you mentioned economically, and I'll just stop with this. Even economically, if you do not have a Christian foundation, you don't have a foundation for societal trust, for civic trust. You don't have the ability in the marketplace for people to act on a handshake. This is something that was fairly typical in the West, and it was unique in the West. In other societies where they don't have that, it has stymied economic growth. So even in terms of the economy. We can go down that road as well.
Yeah.
If you want the greatest success, again, Christian values need to underpin it.
Now, I'm just going to dive in here a little bit because there's going to be some people who immediately, just based on even the title of your book, are going to be triggered, and they're going to be angry, and they're going to be thinking a
Right.
lot of things that I think are actually false. Okay. So I wonder if we might spend half a minute talking about what your book is not, and then we can talk about what your book is. And
Right.
so your book is not about saying that everybody has to be Christian at all.
No, no,
Your book is not saying that anybody needs to have a specific theological belief at all. They can
no.
believe in God, they can believe in Jesus, they can believe in neither.
Yeah.
The point of what you're saying is you are looking at specific things that governments have done over the years in the West, and you have looked at them quantitatively, as you've said, and you're saying, listen, when we come at things from this way, from this viewpoint, and with these specific policies, things work out better.
Right.
So this has nothing to do. There's nothing in your book here about forcing people to go to church or forcing anyone to believe any specific thing. In
No.
fact, this is not so much. This is not so much about. This is not about Christianity in a theological or a church sense. There's nothing really in here about how the church should be run or whether people should go to church or anything like that. This is purely about governance. This is
Right. Right.
what principles and what policies should impact a government.
It is dispensing with the fiction that a law can be neutral, that a law can be values neutral. It's dispensing with that fiction. You see, we were sold a lie from the 1960s onward. This notion that we could have a neutral public sphere, that we wouldn't have to take a moral stand. And in chapter 6 of my book, I go through that philosophical argument and show how it's just not tenable. That all laws are moral signalers. They say something is good or not good. The fact that a government would say, go ahead and do this, is actually saying this is a good thing. So the other point that you raised is we didn't use the word yet, but this is not about a theocracy. I talk in my book at length about theocracies that are happening right now in the world. Typically, they're in Muslim majority countries. And I say that is not a model to follow. What I am saying is let's embrace traditional conservatism, which is the norms and values of Christianity applied to governance as it was done across the West when we experienced our greatest flourishing. And even when I say we experienced our greatest flourishing, this is again not my opinion. I bring the receipts. I show economic histories. I show social histories. I bring up that data and show really we were unsurpassed, and it was all due to this Christian foundation. Back to this notion of theocracy. It is not the Christian position ever that we should compel belief. Christians don't do that, at least not Christians who are following their founder. The
Yep.
idea of a separation between church and state, that's Christians' baby. We made
Yeah.
that up. That's
Yeah.
our stuff. You don't
Yeah.
get that anywhere else.
Yeah, you know what, and I really appreciate that you brought that up because we live in an era which is so far removed from a general understanding of Christianity. People do not understand the history, and really the kind of liberty that we have now, the full-bodied liberty that we aspire to, or that has been achieved to one degree or another. The best examples of those have occurred in the most Christian of contexts, the most Christian of countries. So there is no true liberty outside of a Christian infused country. And I say that not as a proclamation, but just as a statement of fact. That's a reality. There have been other countries that have tried using similar language to create societies of liberty, explicitly undermining God and Christianity, and they have utterly failed. You
Mhm.
look at you look at, for example, the kind of liberty that sprung up in the United States, in Britain, in Canada, which to these days those countries are viewed as sort of the pinnacle of liberty. Obviously, we have issues with where some of our countries have gone, but there certainly are no other countries in the world with better track records of sort of personal freedoms and liberties. We effectively invented the concept. If you look at revolutionary France, who came up with human rights documents, came up with lofty language. It was a bloodbath and a tyranny
Mhm.
there. I mean, it was not in any sense the same as the Christian infused liberties. You take a look at communism in the Soviet Union. They again had prolific human rights documents and lofty language, and yet we know that those countries as well, who were explicitly atheist and hostile to Christianity, were not hotbeds of liberty. They devolved into a group-led tyranny with small groups of privileged people at the top. So, and on again, we're covering a lot in a few minutes, but even the concept of separation of church and state, a lot of people don't understand that. It was, again, obviously there was some support from that from various quarters, but Washington got that directly from Baptist members of his army who were well aware of the history of the combination of church and state, and where you privilege one specific group, the harms that can result. And so
But
that whole,
when they did it,
yes,
and I know
go
you're going
ahead.
to get to this, they were not saying a separation of Christian morality and state.
Yes,
They were
yes,
saying that the church does not become the government, but they were
yes,
never trying to divorce Christian morality from government because they
yes.
knew, and we should all know, that laws do promote a moral stand. And so you better choose the one that history and empirical evidence says will work the best.
Yes, and I should add that the current understanding of the concept of church and state is, in my view, quite different than it was when the people wrote those words and founded those concepts. So, but I just wanted to point out that the very concept of separation of church and state, which yes is misunderstood, was came out of a Christian context, and it came from people who understood that the freedom of conscience is the highest virtue given by God to people to discern the direction that they ought to travel with respect to their service to God, and their the way that they would conduct themselves in faith communities.
And the thing that is unique, so people will often hear people like you, people like me, we're saying Christianity leads to freedom. And it does. And they say, yeah, but you guys aren't as free as the libertarians. You guys aren't as free as the classical liberals. And my response to that is Christianity is the experiment that actually found the perfect balance between freedom and responsibility. And you don't want to live in a society of unfettered freedom. We know what that's like. Go to San Francisco, go to Portland, go to the places that have become hellholes where there's feces on the street and drug addicts, or go to Vancouver, right? So, this notion that we just want freedom, 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 that doesn't work either. But Christianity has found this incredible balance between let's give maximum freedom, but also have the common good. And it is the only system that has been able to get that balance right. Does it sometimes historically get it wrong because humans are fallible? Yep, it does. But the thing about Christianity, it also insists you are fallible as a human. So we need to have checks and balances. Again, it accommodates for everything. You also had we were making some pretty bold claims. We're saying that Christianity, Christian nations like England, the United States, and Canada, they have greater freedom. Canada, among them, has been not as great as originally the UK and then America. America still is the paragon of this. But what I would point out is we can even, in my book, I cite experiments that were done writ large across the globe. Here's one from Robert Woodbury that I mentioned, and comes from chapter 3. So I make the case that Christian norms and values are unmatched in producing liberty, producing societal goodness at the level of the nation. And I have various proofs for that, but I'll give a very quick example. There was a study done around 2016 by a sociologist, Robert Woodbury, and I think it took him 12 years to do this study because he gathered so much data. And it was very advanced statistical analysis. He did a multivariate regression analysis, which enables you to tease out variables that aren't going in a particular direction. You say, yeah, that one doesn't work. Not because you're trying to get rid of it because it's inconvenient, it's because it doesn't connect. Like you can clearly see the
Right.
variables that aren't really driving the phenomenon, but you also are able to find the variables that are. So he puts it out in 2016 in the American Journal of Political Science, top journal in the world for political science at a quantitative level. He calls it the missionary roots of liberal democracy. And what he found after studying the developing world, so he looks at countries in the developing world where two countries are side by side. They have almost identical resources, identical geography, identical kind of people groups. And he notes that some become flourishing nations economically, in terms of liberty, in terms of education, health systems, and others don't. Instead, they decline into tyranny. And he says, what's the key variable here? And the key variable that he was able to find through statistical analysis was whether or not they had devout, practicing Christians in Protestant denominations working with the local population. That these missionaries, they were devout Christians, independent and wanting the best for the population. And he said, this is explaining most of that difference. And he went on to win numerous prizes for his research. Of course, there were many people who were trying to debunk what he said. Many had to admit that he was right. But I point that out because we do have studies at the national level that show the goodness of Christianity. And my book goes into that at length. When I'm making these claims, they're supported by the evidence.
Yeah, and it's a good point, and I just wanted to touch on something you had mentioned earlier about sort of, let's say libertarianism, classical liberalism, and so on. And what I see right now in Canada, we have a country that is extremely free, libertarian almost on the social side. So up until recently, if you even wanted clean, free, hard drugs, you could get them fairly easily. You can get married or divorced or live with as many different people as you want. You can, do pretty much, abortion. You can do whatever you want kind of socially. But we're not so free on the economic side right now. The cost of, taxation is very high. Cost of living is high. And, we're having these, tons of homeless people everywhere that need to be dealt with. And when you talk about balance, whenever you get out of balance on one side, you ultimately lose something on the other. So in some senses, we're quote unquote free in Canada, but ask a young kid how free they feel. And I was just speaking with a woman today whose son is sort of, I believe he's 18 or 19 at the cusp of sort of starting out on his own, and he feels just downright, his constant thoughts are those of sort of that should be for someone much older, like how am I going to provide for myself or buy a home or the kinds of things that you would think would never be on the mind of an 18-year-old. That is what our youth right now are experiencing. And there's a study that just came out that's saying that Generation Z or the Gen Z, they're drinking less and doing less drugs and so on, but it is accompanied by less risk-taking behavior across the spectrum. So they are not taking risks like getting married, having kids, the kinds of risks that establish you in adulthood. And so we're seeing this imbalance that is destroying families, creating, abundant homelessness and mental health issues and addiction. And so I think your point on balance is entirely accurate, and you need to get that synced up. Otherwise, things get completely out of whack.
Right. Well, I think that the balance that Christianity brings, and again, I'm talking as a sociologist, not as a theologian, it has always been very important within Christianity to balance mercy and justice, right? Mercy and justice, or grace, but truth. And this has been the power of Christianity, that it holds these very separate, very distinct concepts in tension with each other, but doesn't abandon one. I would say that many of the problems we have in society right now are because we have overdosed on mercy and we have forgot about true justice. And this is G.K. Chesterton. I mentioned him in my book. He says that society today is just Christian virtues gone mad.
Yes, I 100% agree with that, David.
And
100%.
and you actually need to have the side of Christianity that says, no, wait a minute. We don't give everything away, actually. We actually have an obligation to care for our communities and our family. We read about this, and so the Apostle Paul, he's writing a letter to Timothy, and he says, you know what? If you don't care for your family and your community first,
Yeah.
you're worse than a non-believer.
Yeah.
The suggestion there is open borders were never a Christian concept. This idea of unfettered immigration is not a Christian concept at all. It is now to the detriment of the citizens of our country. Yes, do Christians have great concern for those people who suffer through no fault of their own? Yes, we do. Will we experience hardship in order to help people who suffer through no fault of their own? Yes, but it was never at the expense of our own families. It was never meant to be that. It's again that balance that Christianity has struck. The fact
No,
that go ahead.
Sorry, David, I'm just going to you know what, actually finish your thought, and then I'm going to just quickly jump in on that. I had something I wanted to say.
Well, we see this in a couple areas of Canadian society. First of all, we see it in this mass immigration that we experience now. The people coming to Canada, they are not suffering. The majority are coming from India, which is a safe country. I mean, even the Canadian government registers it as a safe country. And yet they will come in, and when they're about to lose their visa status, they say, I'm a refugee. And then we pay for them. And then they get goods and services that even our poorest Canadian citizens don't get. That is complete injustice. The Christian, or we'll call the traditional conservatism, because that's the project I'm advancing, would say, no, that doesn't happen. They leave and they get nothing because they're not suffering. They simply want to take advantage of a system that is allowing them to, because we've overdosed on mercy. Yeah. Similarly, I'd say the whole notion of DEI, and I've got a chapter in my book, chapter 4, where first of all, I show that there is no academic pedigree for DEI. That is to say, there's no research basis for it. There's no proof. It's a bunch of snake oil. But I do show the research is clear. It does harm. But again, this is mercy without justice, because what we see with DEI is they're trying to make up for past wrongs, and to do so, they're showing impartiality. That is totally against the Christian's idea of justice. The Christian idea of justice has always been it is impartial. Yes. That begins in the Old Testament. It's brought through to the New, and we've disregarded that completely. We've thrown that out completely. And now what's happening? We're seeing our society unravel.
Yeah, and further to that, if someone is to be punished, it is because they have done something. Hi, everybody. We just had a bit of a glitch there, but David, I just wanted to jump in and respond to some of the things that you've said. One of the great books I've read over the last 5 or so years is books by Vishal Mangalwadi, and one of his books. Generally his theme is how the Bible has impacted society. And so he has a book called The Book That Made Your World, How the Bible Created the Soul of Western civilization. And he says a lot of things in there. And the funny thing is like just a little brief like overview for the average person on the degree to which Christianity has impacted the world in a positive way would be great for people to learn in school, because the very concepts that we associate with sort of modernity and like kind of Canada and like things like that. Vishal Mangalwadi, who is an Indian national, but a Christian philosopher who lives in the United States. And he's not the only one to talk about this. There's many people who've spoken about this, but he goes through all the different ways that Christianity has impacted the West, everything from the creation of our individual languages to literature, to the way that we do science, to keeping time, to private property, to our democratic forms of governance, not the least of which are things like the invention of hospitals as we know them today, schools, higher education. All of the first hospitals in almost every country in the world, including places like China, were founded by Christian missionaries. And, this kind of thing is lost on people, but the specific, so that was a little plug for, the benefits of Christianity. The specific comment on high trust societies, most people who have been born and bred in the West don't really know what it's like in other countries. They may have visited for a week or two, but Vishal spent many years actually as a missionary doing mission work. Even though he's from India, he did a lot of Christian mission in India, and he's traveled to many other countries. And so he has a good grasp of sort of what is intrinsic to the West and what is not. And one thing he made a comment about in one of his books is in countries like, let's say, the Netherlands and even Canada, it's very common to have a unmanned sales station at the end of a road. So if you're driving in a rural area, you'll often see firewood or eggs or other produce for sale. And they have a little bucket of money out there. You put your money in, you take the eggs, and you go. And he said something as simple as this just doesn't fly in other countries. Nobody would ever leave money and or produce unattended at the end of a road because people would take it. They would take the money, they would take the food. And so he actually did a historical analysis where he went back in time and showed how the various, kind of theological, all the different, Lutherans and Reformed Church, they would have a little catechism, and they would, the kids would be drilled in the catechism. And the catechism was essentially the Bible, but also extrapolated into, thou shalt not steal. But what does that mean in the context of your working relationship? You should work diligently and hard. You shouldn't steal from your employee by being lazy, by wasting your time. If you're an employer, you should not steal from your employees by underpaying them, by delaying paying them, by treating them unjustly. These kind of concepts were woven into the Western mind for hundreds and hundreds of years so that we could have a society that does operate on trust. Largely, obviously, there's bad eggs in every bunch, but you can actually move forward in business ventures because you're more or less sure that the person you're dealing with will follow through on what they say. There's a court system that is generally, hopefully, uncorrupted historically over the course of our history, that you can pursue your grievances. And this kind of just generic trust that we take for granted has led to economic flourishing, amongst other things. But that is a fact. And I just, one other point I'm just going to make quickly: the idea that Christian values run amok are causing problems is reflected in many things that we see. The sort of unlimited and unbridled compassion that drives some of the DEI and other concepts. That is Christian. Compassion does not arise on its own. It is not a feature of other non-Christian countries. Compassion, there's an absence of compassion generally in the world. But so even those things, and he gave an example in his book, Vishal Mangalwadi. He said that when they were sending their daughter to school in India, they had to make sure that they walked with her to the bus stop and that they held her hand, because not only could she be kidnapped or something like that, but even the style of driving there, uh, they were afraid she'd get run down in the street, and and that nobody would stop and nobody would do anything. And about the time I read that in his book, I happened to be watching. I don't watch mainstream news very much, but I happened to be at a place that had that going, and it was CTV and all these different channels. There was somebody in Toronto who had Down syndrome, a young adult, and they had gotten lost from their house. They had wandered out of the house. Nobody knew where this person was. Every single major news station in Toronto was doing nonstop updates throughout the day about where this person might be and if you've seen this person. And, I thought, and I'm not a fan of mainstream news, but I thought, you know what? That's exactly what Vishal Mangalwadi is talking about. The idea that a city, a big city, and all their major media would stop everything and focus on this one person that got lost. That is our Christian roots coming out. They wouldn't even think about doing that in other countries. Their little daughter might have gotten run down at the bus stop. Nobody would have batted an eye at it. But this is coming. So even the left-wing people that are doing things that are too far, they don't realize it comes from a Christian sense of compassion and duty. And really, to get those values synced up, we need to go back to the source of those values and recalibrate.
Sure. And I can I can first of all agree, and I would say that someone interested in the factual evidence for exactly what you're saying could look at chapter 7 of my book, because I actually show they've done numerous studies about civic trust across the world, and I cite those studies. And for example, just give you one that was a world population, hundreds of countries, over 100 countries were examined, and they did what was called a coin flip experiment with people from China and India and Western countries. And the idea was you flip a coin and then you have to self-report whether or not it was heads or tails. And you would get a reward if you hit heads more often than tails. And of course, the probability should be 50%. And what they found that both in India, countries of the Middle East, the cheating was astronomical, was significant. And yet in Western countries, particularly those that had a dominant Protestant ethos, the levels of non-cheating, of honesty, were the highest. Another experiment was done with
that's fascinating.
This was reported in the esteemed journal Science, where they took wallets and lost wallets. They weren't really lost. They were put out by the researchers. And again, they put them out in Western nations. They put them out in China, Middle East, India. And the levels of dishonesty or lack of returning the lost wallet were highest in these non-Christian nations. And they were highest in the nations that had a foundation of Protestantism, in fact, which again is really in the Protestant tradition, at least in the conservative Protestant tradition, the level of personal honesty is drilled in to children. It is part of the catechism done at home, and it has an effect. So where I go in the book with this, after showing that it's very clear from the evidence that there isn't the level of civic trust in these other places, what happens when you bring in people in mass numbers to Western nations where there was a high level of civic trust? Well, the people who are the natural citizens, the heritage citizens, the long-standing citizens of the West, they're not prepared for it. You see, they assume that people are going to behave honestly. And so they become I guess in the long con, they call it, they become, what's the word where you are the dupe? I guess you're the dupe. And so like in 2023 or 24, there was $10 billion of fraud perpetrated by people from India against those in the United States. That's just what the FBI had reported. In Australia, 23,000 workers from India were operating on not illegal, false credentials. And those were just the ones that were found. In Canada, we had, and it's in my book, and I don't like to quote things unless I can quote them accurately,
Yeah.
but a significant number of students coming from India who said that they were in on a student visa never showed up to class. So my warning would be, and I say this in the book, chapter 7 and 8, is you can't expect people who didn't come from Western countries where there was a foundation of Christian norms and values to behave as though they're Western. There's no such thing as magic soil. Somebody just doesn't step on your soil and suddenly they take on the values that really led to the flourishing of the nation. Instead, when you bring in people en masse, they will instead revert to the behaviors that they had in their home country because they will be reinforced by enclaves of people from their own country. And we see that again and again. In fact, if you want to look at crime rates, if you want to see the highest crime rates in Canada, look at the places that have the highest rates of immigration. It used to be the case when we actually vetted immigrants that immigration was linked to lower crime because people were worried that they'd be sent home. And so this is not to say that immigration is always something that will be detrimental. If it's done properly, if it's done through vetting, if it's done in low numbers so that people can acclimatize to the culture, all that can work. But what we have now is completely unworkable. And the statistic evidence shows that in terms of trust, it's lowered significantly. And in terms of crime, it's raised significantly.
So, David, we've spoken a lot about some of the principles underlying your book. We've spoken about some specific examples. Did you want to just start going through and just outlining the skeleton outline of your book and just give us some of the highlights?
I think that it'll be beneficial for people because when somebody hears that there's 600 pages in a book, it can make them nervous. It can make them not want to give it a try. And first of all, I'd say when I wrote this book, I did it knowing that I wanted it to be accessible. I wanted to write it I have young sons and a young daughter. She's 19, my boys are early 20s. I wanted it to be accessible for their generation and enjoyable. So mixed within the quantitative data, which I try to present in as clear a fashion as possible, I also include anecdotes. I also include stories to remember what the data was saying. And back to the size of this book, so almost 600 pages, I divided it into 4 parts. And if somebody, so this thing is a doorstop, right? I mean, you can look at the size of this. I also, and I'm grateful to my publisher, College Press, for this. They decided to divide the book into 4 different volumes. I don't have them here with me, but they actually took the 4 parts of the book and divided it into 4 separate volumes that people can get. And so they address different issues, and I'll talk about the 4 parts of the book. So the first part of the book is really looking at the benefits of Christianity from an empirical point of view. And so chapter 1, I outline the ideas of traditional conservatism. I'm saying, here's what we're going for. We're going for a government that is going to reinforce Christian norms and values. I'll tell you what those Christian norms and values are. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, I make the case, this is nothing new. I show through documentation that's historical as well as legislative that it was always the intent of the founders of both America and Canada that these would be Christian nations. And I show that when those norms and values were put in place, there was success. Then I move to chapter 3, and I show really this is the bulk of the empirical evidence showing the good of Christianity. And I want to show that when these norms and values are applied at the individual and societal level, they're unmatched. So I compare them to other religious systems. For example, and I won't go into it in great detail, but I show that the most charity that is done in India is done by Christians. I show that across the world, wherever the Christian population is, they have the highest levels of charity, even in Muslim majority countries. They have the highest levels of happiness, even in Muslim majority countries. I show that Christian doctrine is unique. In Islam, in terms of charity, they say that you have to give 2.5% of your income. It's called zakat, but they say you only have to give it to Muslims. Christians are unique in that they say you have to give it to people who are in need, even those who aren't your co-religionists. Similarly, with Hinduism, I show that the doctrine of karma says, well, if somebody is suffering, it's because they deserve it. They did something in a past life. So why would we help them? That's why you see in India, the most charity that is done are done by Christian organizations. In fact, it was becoming so popular that the Modi government 10 years ago had to outlaw many Christian institutions because people were converting. So 10,000, actually over 10,000 Christian aid organizations had their ability to practice in India removed. So much for religious liberty. So moving on, my first part is about the goodness of Christianity. Part two looks at what doesn't work in terms of worldview. And I look specifically at progressivism, and I look at the origins of progressivism. And then I show in chapter 5 the outcomes of things like DEI, critical race theory. And I show how it harms society. And I show that Christianity does not support the kind of partiality, the kind of favoritism that we're seeing today from our government, from our schools. It says you shouldn't do that because it will lead to the ruin of society. And it's right. And I show how it is leading to the ruin of society. Then I take a brief diversion into classical liberalism and libertarianism, the freedom people. And I show how that sounds good, but in practice it doesn't work, that you actually do need to have a level of common good where you're working for common good. And people say, well, how do you know what common good is? Well, let's use the empirical standard that was practiced for 2,000 years, or even if you want to do 250 years in North America. We saw that it worked. Let's get back to it. Then I move into part 3, where I talk about nationalism. And I explain that Christianity actually has the means by which nationalism can be healthy. It says you can love your country while still caring for the outsider. And I go into that at length. And in this part, chapter 3, I also show the dangers of mass immigration. I show the lies that are being promoted. We often hear this is a country of immigrants. No, it's not. Canada was not founded as a country of immigrants. It was founded, and this is a category error that people made, it was founded as a country of settlers who came with nothing and created everything. Mm-hmm. Very big difference. Immigrants, and this is a sociological term, immigrants are those who come to an established culture and country and then benefit from it. Settlers are people who come and there was nothing and they built everything and established the culture. And we should be grateful for them. So I debunk some of those lies. I debunked the idea that Canada doesn't have a common culture or didn't, and that the United States didn't have a common culture. It did. And then I move into the last part, part 4. And part 4 is really, well, what do we do with all this knowledge? How do we make traditional conservatism in practice? And again, the whole idea, I'm promoting not a religious revival, but the restoration of a political system that is the natural governing system of North America and the West, traditional conservatism. And I say, how can we make that happen? And what will it look like? And that is part 4. So there are 4 separate volumes. If people wanted to tackle each of those separately, they thought, I just don't have enough time to go into the whole 600 pages, or they can take the deep dive and buy the book that is almost 600 pages. And even if they didn't want to, Derek, the last thing, my kids really love audiobooks now. All of this is available as audiobooks. It can be available through College Press, the publisher, and it's even on Spotify.
Okay, well, that's really exciting. Now, for somebody who wants to pick up your book, is the best place Amazon.ca, or what's the best place
delivery? For fastest, if you're in Canada, even in the US, fast delivery is through Amazon. If you want the audiobook, it's instantaneous. You can get it through College Press. They have the service there. Or if you already have a Spotify account, you can do that. The ebook is also available numerous places. So those are kind of your selections.
Now, your book was a bestseller for a period of time. Maybe it
still is. Actually,
okay.
it is. And sorry, not to be conceited in that, but I'm
Yeah.
grateful. There are people reading it. And in Canada, it still is ranked number one in philosophy and religion, comparative government, church and state. I think there are about five categories where it's still the number one. And this is without a lot of well, without any mainstream media support. So I'm grateful.
Yeah, that's really, really exciting. There's so much more that we could talk about. I know that we're limited in time today, but really we could do an hour segment on every different section of your book. Um, one thing I might bring up here. So there's obviously going to be people who are, adamantly opposed to your work. There's going to be people who like your work. There's going to be people who are friendly to your work, but don't agree with everything. I think that you know you said that you're not trying to revive. This isn't a religious revival. This is not trying
Right.
to convert anybody to Christianity. It's not also trying to convert anyone to a specific political party. It's not like you're advocating for a specific, let's say the Conservative Party or something. But what you're saying is in your term traditional conservatism, which is what you sort of uh, define your uh, political beliefs in this book as, is basically that whatever value you're pushing for in conservatism, whether it's fiscal sanity or immigration sanity or any of these things, without a Christian ethos underpinning that, you're going to go too far. You're going to be imbalanced, or maybe not far enough, depending on what the
Yeah, I
issue
mean, you
is.
can also be harsh, right? I
Yes,
mean, conservatism can be harsh. Christianity, when it's brought to governance, finds that balance. And right now, the conservatives who are leading our so-called conservative parties, they hate social conservatives. Like they hate them.
yes,
And so really they are nothing because they have unmoored themselves. They're no longer connected to the Christian norms and values that really do lead to flourishing. They're nothing more than slow walking liberals. Like they've got nothing to hold them back from the abyss. And we've seen this again and again. It's I in chapter. Sorry, I'm well. We're talking about the book, but
yes.
chapter
Go ahead.
nine,
Yeah,
I go through and I say I'm going to talk about the conservative movements that completely abandoned conservatism because they were unmoored from their Christian foundation, and it happens again and again and again and again. And I compare it to the idea of entropy that ultimately we move toward chaos, and that happens politically as well.
yeah. Well, that's a really good point. And so and another segment of viewers who would be potentially watching this interested in your ideas are those who are, again, close to your beliefs but not quite, and that would be sort of the libertarians slash classical liberals. And so that would probably deserve its own show in its own
Mhm.
right. But did you want to just spend a couple of minutes differentiating yourself, your ideology from the classical liberal libertarian freedom types, because there is a lot of overlap in, sort of conservative activism. There's
Yeah.
definitely a strong overlap and friendship
Yeah.
amongst, Christian conservatives and libertarian style conservatives.
And traditional conservatives who are grounded in the norms and values of Christianity, they really want smaller government. They want government
Yes,
mostly out of our lives,
yes,
right? Uh, they they are very much aligned with the libertarians on this. Let's get the government out of most things and let people make their own decisions. But the problem that the libertarians move into is that they abandon the common good completely. And society can't exist without a common good. And they also will not take a moral stand. They've got the non aggression principle. They call it the NAP. This is kind of their guiding light. Uh, I won't do anything to you if you don't do anything to me. That's their 10 commandments in one. And you can't live like that. You see, uh, the idea that we can just let someone it misses the fact that we all are interconnected and that in our interconnectedness we do affect others. For example, they would suggest that the drug addict who is just getting high is not doing harm to anybody else. And I point out in my book in chapter 6, I say, well, well, the fact that the drug addict has to do that somewhere is already harming somewhere else. They're going to be they're going to be on a teeter-totter or a slide in a playground. In fact, when that happened, and I mentioned this in the book, when that happened in Vancouver, the judges said that it was the rights of the drug addicts who were on the teeter-totters and the slides that should take precedence, not the children who were being exposed to this debauchery. Like again, this is the Christian
Yep.
values gone amok.
Yeah,
So
and it leads to crime as well. Like I mean, we're seeing in the area that I live an increase in petty crime and so on, and it's primarily a small. It's the same 5 to 12 people that are
yeah,
part of a larger cohort of the kind of drug addicted homeless community, and because we don't have the appropriate treatment philosophy or spaces for them, they're getting arrested all the time and released. And that may be giving them their right to do what they want to do, but it's impacting everybody else.
and it really does give the right. We're extending this additional right to people, but we're removing it from the victims, right?
Yeah.
And this is not what Christianity would ever do. Christianity would say, yes, we are obligated to assist those who suffer through no fault of their own, but we also must have, with that mercy, we must have justice. And we've lost that. And this is, and I point out in the book where I differ from the libertarians is I say, I don't want it to be just my capricious fiat, my suddenly Dave Haskell's will. I want to take what has worked for a long time, 2,000 years, and especially as it was refined in the West from definitely the 1800s, moving through the 1700s, 1800s, as we begin to see the British civil system and the legal system. Anyway, I want to take what works, not my ideas, but what we would say are the Christian norms and values that have been time tested, and I want to see those applied again. So this is getting to the point. The difference between libertarians and a traditional conservative is traditional conservatives believe there are moral absolutes, and we don't have to just say, well, we're doing it because God said, although that I don't mind that if someone wants to take that position. But I'd say you could use the empirical position as well and say, I'm not taking the metaphorical stand, the metaphysical stand. I am taking the empirical stand and I'm saying, I can show you that this works better. So that is a deficit. I make a joke in my book. I say, how do I know that traditional conservative laws and values and norms are better than those that are put forward by libertarians and classical liberals? And I say, I know that they're better because they are what the libertarians and classical liberals fall back on when their own philosophy fails. As you pursue it and you say, well, what about, you're saying you want, no, as long as it's not harming anybody. What about the big burly dude who says he's a woman and now he's stripping nude in the change room at the Y and your daughter's there? Oh, well, I'd kick him out. Oh, really? He's not harming your daughter. He's just appearing nude in front of her with all his pieces showing. Oh, but there's something wrong about that. Yes, there is. Welcome to traditional conservatism, right? We make a lot of converts that way when they realize the deficits of their own philosophy.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And the one kind of thing I come back to, and there's obviously many things to discuss, but in a, let's say, extremely reduced society from a government oversight perspective, all good libertarians believe that you need, a strong military and a good police force and a good court system to adjudicate disputes. I don't think you can get there without a Christian society. You cannot have a police force that is largely and legal system that is largely incorruptible or not corrupt. You will not have people who are inspired to protect their country without God, king, and country, writ large, right?
So, here, to your point, you want to know how you get legal protection in India? You pay for
Money.
it.
Exactly.
You pay for it. You want to know how you get the police to come and investigate your crime? You pay them.
Yeah.
So this notion that we would have a police force that would then enforce the libertarian ideals, I'm just saying you're absolutely
Yeah.
right. You can't have that police force unless it is reinforced and founded on Christian norms and values.
Yes. It comes down to it comes down to basically the general morality of the population and their general goodness, so to speak. And there is no way of inculcating morality or goodness or goodwill or high trust without a genuine adoption of Christianity amongst a sizable enough proportion of the population to
Okay,
make a
now
difference.
you've raised a really good point, and this might be a good spot for us to end. So throughout, both you and I have said, especially me, I am not compelling belief. I don't want belief compelled. I do want a separation of church and state. And you do not have to believe in the metaphysical claims of Christianity to follow traditional conservatism. 100% agree with that. But at several points in my text, I say, but we do need people who actually do believe this stuff. Well, my book is not trying to advocate a religious revival. I'm saying that if there were a religious revival of some kind, not compelled just by choice because people said, wow, this whole system seems really divinely ordained. There's nothing that matches it. Maybe that is proof of its divine nature. If that were to happen, to the extent that the heart and the head align, we would have even greater flourishing. So I don't want that to be denied. I don't want it to pretend like I'm a Christian. I am devoutly Christian. I believe that the Bible is the Word of God. I believe that the ideas of Christ and Christianity should guide my life. I think that that is a better way for people to operate. I would never force it on anyone. But I just want to make it maybe as even a final comment. Yes, I am for the political project of traditional conservatism, but I also am happy when I see Christianity thrive because traditional conservatism and Christianity rise together. And so I'll leave it at that. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your time today, David. I know that our time is running to an end here, but I think that what you're bringing forward is very important, and I firmly believe, and again, just there's going to be so many people that try and spin this in many different ways. Obviously, one of the things that we believe as Christians is that you can't compel belief. You
No,
can try, but a person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. I mean, you can try all you want to force people to believe any number of things, and if they don't truly believe it, they'll push back. So obviously, that you know, that is not our goal, but our goal is to convince people logically and rationally that this is the best way. And I think that what you outline in your book is actually appealing to anybody of goodwill. And I've spoken to some people who are not Christians in practice, but are friendly to the idea of Christian values governing a country. They're well aware of the historic reality of the success of the West, and they're very friendly to these ideas as well. And I think that the book you've written, yes, Christians are going to like this book, but even so, people who are people of an open mind and open hearts, I think they'll find a lot of good stuff in this book as well. And I think what you're putting forward could be something that could be largely acceptable in this country. And frankly, up until a short time ago, you mentioned the 60s. I'll tell you, even in the 80s, when they were bringing the charter forward, the Liberal members of Parliament under Pierre Trudeau insisted on the preamble,
right.
recognizing the supremacy of God. They said, listen, we're hearing from our constituents the general idea that people believe Canada is a Christian country and frankly think that this should be in the charter. So, up until very recently, it was commonplace for people to consider Canada
Yeah.
and the US a Christian country. And there's nothing wrong with it. And it did nothing
It only did
in most
good.
parts to help us. Yeah.
And okay, so last thought. We keep saying last thought. It's like when you're on a plane and they say, just 20 minutes until takeoff, and then
Yeah.
20 minutes. So I'm not going to do this. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a forced choice. Ultimately, there will be a dominant ideology,
Yes.
and ultimately, it's going to either lead your country to a road on a road to success or to a road to failure. And there's only been one particular method in the West that has really had unmatched success, unmatched thriving. So people have to make a choice. There is no such thing as a neutral public square.
Yeah.
We have to make a choice, and why not choose the one that has been proven to have the best outcomes?
David, thank you so much for your time today. We'll talk to you soon, and looking forward to hearing more about your book and your ideas to revive traditional conservatism in Canada.
Thanks for your time.